All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for registering for our webinar where we're going to feature best-selling author Teresa Lina on her book, Be the Go-To. The book is on market dominance, and what I love about it is that it's applicable to any size company, big or small. Before we get started, I thought I'd walk you through how we're going to spend the next hour. We're going to start after some brief introductions. We're going to have Teresa Lina walk us through the highlights of her book. And then, because I've read the book cover to cover, I'm going to interview her with some questions. And then for the last 10 minutes, we're going to open it up to all of you if you have questions. Just use the chat feature down below on the Zoom meeting function, and we'll be sure to take as many questions as possible, provided there is sufficient time. So let's start with a brief introduction. I'll introduce myself. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Paula Courtney, and I'm the CEO of the Verde Group. The Verde Group is a market research consultancy, and we specialize in improving and growing customer loyalty for companies. We do this virtually in every continent, and we do this by quantifying the financial risk of negative customer experiences. We've been doing this for over 2 decades. I feel very privileged that the Verde Group is featured in Teresa's book, Be the Go-To, among some of the business greats such as Amazon and Tesla. I'm especially privileged that I've been able to persuade the author, Teresa Lina, to actually do this webinar with me. And I want to introduce Teresa. So Teresa is based in Silicon Valley. She's actually out of San Francisco, and she has been a marketing strategist for about 25 years. She has consulted to some of the business greats, and she also lectures at the Stanford Business School. She does a lot of work and a lot of collaboration with Stanford Business School, teaching strategy and innovation, and we are incredibly excited to have her join us. So without further ado, I'm turning over the reins to Teresa. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you so much. And before we get started, I want to make sure everybody can see my screen. So am I up and running here? Great. And then please do feel free to participate in the chat. Let us see what you're thinking and comments and questions. And then Paula will get to some of those questions later on, but we also want you to feel as if you can freely engage here. These webinars are such a funky environment. So I thought I'd start by just talking about answering actually a common question I get, which is what started me down this path in the first place. And ironically, it was acting auditions. When I was fresh out of college, I was a management consultant during the day, and in the evenings I took acting classes for fun, and I'd show up at these auditions and everybody would look the same. You know, from a distance, there was absolutely no way to distinguish yourself or get a casting director's attention without doing something insanely gimmicky, which wasn't really accomplishing anything. And so I really started to wonder, how do certain companies, how do you stand out? I was on the phone one day with a subcontractor for my consulting business, and we were actually facing some of the same pressures that a lot of you may be facing in your markets, where we were getting a lot of pricing pressure from our clients. And she was telling me how a friend of hers was charging $50,000 a day to do the same thing that we were doing. And I was dumbfounded by that, but also really inspired. I was like, how in the world is she doing that? So it set me down a path to try to figure out, why is it that certain companies seem to become the clear leader in their space and they can command whatever price they want, and customers happily pay that price, while other companies doing very similar work sometimes struggle. So it set me down a research path, and I started realizing, you know, the really big issue was the same as my acting auditions. As people put up their shingle, whether it's a big company or a small company, they put a product out there, an offering, they think they're so unique and up close. Maybe they are, just like human beings are unique up close, but from a distance, we're all just part of the pile of snow. And to our customers, we look and sound like everybody else. And so the fundamental issue that companies run into is there's no clear, sustainable differentiation. Now, a space that's really interesting to look at that's very representative of what goes on out there, but it's relatively new, so it's interesting to look at, is the marketing technology landscape. So about a decade ago, there were only approximately 150 companies in that space. But look at what's happened year by year. There's been exponential growth in the competition in this space, to the point where probably by this year, there may be closer to 8,000 companies in this space, and buyers have no idea where to even start to figure out what tool they ought to be using and which version of which tool they should be using. So it's a big issue. And here's what happens. Once you become commoditized, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, and if you can't, you will, is we end up having to drop our prices and our margins get squeezed. So our costs very rarely go down. So eventually we end up scratching and clawing for business. We have to drop those prices, and eventually you're on a path to death. So the question is it going to be a slow death or a fast death? So then we wonder, well, what do we do about this? And that's the research path I set out to that's the fundamental question I set out to answer, is how do the companies that do this achieve this kind of success in these competitive markets? So I realized that really what every company needed to do is not just aim to be toward the top of the list, but they needed to aim to win in their space and be the go-to in their space. And let's look at what that means. So a go-to is the first name that comes to mind when you think of a particular market problem or opportunity. Customers actively seek those companies out. No one can deliver on that problem the way they can. They have a very special approach to doing things. Their reputation precedes them. Customers actually seek them out because they already know about the company, and they rarely have to compete for business. They also often, as I've said, can name their price because they deliver such superior value and they deliver results to their customers. And we'll talk more about that later. And then you're viewed as the best, and people want to work with you. So you don't have to compete as much for great employees either. So the fundamental strategy for how you go about becoming the go-to, and I go into a lot of detail on this in the book, but I will give you the basic strategy in a sentence or two, and then we'll walk through some of the key pieces that need to happen. So the basic strategy is you choose an urgent, critical market problem that you want to own, and you offer a unique solution to that problem. And you make it so focused and effective that you become known as the only one to go to for that issue. And you deliver such high value that, number one, you set the market agenda. You make the rules out in the market. Right prospects actively come out and look for you, and you get paid very well for the value you deliver. So this is the fundamental strategy that you're trying to execute. And so what happens is, even while other companies are watching their margins fall, you can actually watch your margins grow because you're increasing your stature in the market, and you're actually delivering such value that you can increase your prices over time. So then the question becomes how? How do we do this? What are the steps? So to figure this out, I did a lot of homework. First of all, I looked at my experience at Accenture. We had been involved in building a brand new business unit from scratch in an already competitive market dominated by some existing players. And we built that to over $850 million in organic growth in about a decade. So I looked at what we did to achieve that kind of success and have the kind of margins we had. And then, ironically enough, I also spent some time looking at the Apollo space program, because I started realizing that a lot of the things that it took to put a man on the moon in the 1960s are the same things that it takes to achieve stature as the go-to in a space. And then I talked to hundreds of other executives, interviewed many, many executives at many, many different companies, and did a lot of other research to figure out what the pattern was. And it boiled down to these four pieces. The four steps, and I'll get into each of these in a moment, are launch, ignite, navigate, and accelerate. So there are four phases that you're going to go through to achieve this. So the first piece is launch. You launch yourself into the market, and you do this by articulating a vision around a particular market problem, and you declare a unique approach to solving that problem. You figure out what problem you want to own. So this is your moonshot. This is what you want to be known for in the market. You decide what that is, and then you develop a point of view around that problem, and you create or define a unique approach to solving that problem. So, for example, with the Apollo space program, what was happening in the late 50s is that we were in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and we were also trying to win the space race. So both superpowers were having incremental battles. We would do a little bit to achieve an accomplishment with some rocket technology, and then just as we were about to have success, the Russians would beat us. And this kept happening, and at one point they put Sputnik up, and that was an earth-shattering moment for the Americans, and they realized, oh my God, we are losing this. And Kennedy said to Vice President Johnson, what will it take to clearly dominate in space, because we want to represent the free world? And Johnson went back, conferred with all the space experts, and told Kennedy, if we send a man to the moon and bring him home alive, we will have won. We think we know how to do it. We're not 100% sure, but we have a vague vision of what it will take, and we can win if we do it. So Kennedy got up in front of the world and said, he declared his moonshot, and that's of course where the phrase comes from. He said, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him home within the decade. So we see a lot of other companies that successfully do this. Amazon decided to go own the book space, the online book selling space when it first started out. Walt Disney said, I want good, wholesome family entertainment I can take my kids to. Apple wanted to own simple, elegant computer design when it first started out. And we see with Verde Group, what I love about them as an example and why I use them in the book is they have a very counterintuitive point of view. They say you can actually profit from customer dissatisfaction. So the second phase, after you've decided what you want to own, what you want to be known for, and what your unique approach is going to be to solving the problem, you go out and your goal is to ignite the market around your point of view. You want to lead a movement out there. And you do this by exuding passionate conviction in what it is you are doing. You rally influencers around the approach. And a big key here is you get power brokers and influencers, and I don't mean social media influencers who just get paid to put a post up, but true influencers who are going to really rally the market around what it is you're doing and become evangelists on your behalf to help you build momentum in the marketplace. So we actually saw a lot of this with the Apollo space program. In fact, they did so much marketing that there's an entire book written about it by these two gentlemen, and it's really fantastic. So I highly recommend it. But they set out on an information campaign. They sent very detailed technical information to the news outlets. They provided scale models so that the news networks at the time could educate the public on what was happening. They had a big campaign with Life magazine that featured the astronauts and turned them into people and followed their family stories and got people invested in their success. And then of course, we've seen other business leaders out there doing this. We know Elon Musk is very passionate about electric technology, electric car technology. And with the Verde Group, they have a point of view and they've done research, and they say on any given day, you can lose 21% of your revenue because of unhappy customers. So they've done this as well. In the navigate phase, what we're doing is actually walking the talk. So here's where you get out and you guide customers along the journey, and you implement your approach with the right customers, and you deliver outcomes. And that's a big difference between this approach and what a lot of companies do. A lot of companies offer products or services, and they're selling functions and features, or they're selling capabilities. And you don't want to do that. You need to sell results to your customers and outcomes. So in this phase, it's a lot of the things you think of with operationalizing and selling and marketing your offering. You find the right customers, you deliver on your promises, you develop a complete solution, deliver those results. And then another key strategy is developing a community of believers who believe in your approach and are get together and support it in the marketplace and support it with each other. So with the Apollo space program, there were numerous missions that led up to getting a man on the moon. It was a complete solution. It took all kinds of, there were all kinds of moving parts. They had to figure out what were the astronauts going to wear? What were they going to eat? How were they going to use the bathroom? They had to teach them to be geologists so they could collect proper samples from the moon's surface. It was a very involved effort and involved lots of different people. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is the concept of whole product, where you're bringing all the pieces together for the customer instead of leaving it to the customer to pull the pieces together. And even the space program did this. So we see this with lots of other companies. Amazon, for example, with its merchants, provides a total solution for people that are selling on the Amazon platform. They provide all of the customer interaction, the payment processing, the fulfillment activity, the delivery activity. So you don't have to do anything. You put your product up on the Amazon platform and boom, everything else is taken care of by Amazon. And they charge a nice, hefty price for that, and they make huge margins, but customers are happy to pay for it because there's so much value there. So with Verde Group, one thing that they came out with early on, even early in their life cycle, was the Revenue at Risk program, where they would actually go in and they weren't just selling survey services or traditional market research services. They were actually selling a total solution to help you figure out what's upsetting your customers and what can be done about it and how much financial impact could that have on your business. And I know I'm sounding a little bit like a Verde Group commercial, and that's not why Paula had me come on to talk, but I do think what they offer is so fabulous that I like using them as an example of how to implement this, especially for a smaller company, since a lot of my examples are big, well-known companies at this point. Then the final stage is so important. You have to stay ahead of the competition. Even if you come out of the gate and you're completely unique, there are going to be other companies that come along to be just like you, copycats that come along, me too's. And so what you have to do is stay ahead of the competition. There are also going to be intense market changes going on around you. I mean, if we haven't seen this year how quickly things can change, then you'll never get the message, right? So it's very important to always be looking on the horizon to see what could come along. So you're trying to watch your back, and you're deepening the loyalty with your existing customers and expanding your customer base. But in the meantime, you're always watching what's going on in the market and working to stay ahead. So even with the Apollo space program, it did not stop when we put a man on the moon and brought him home. They kept going, they kept evolving, they kept taking it even further, making it that much harder for the other superpower, for the Soviets to catch up or trump us in some way. And what was beautiful about the Apollo space program is the US really lived up to its promise of letting space represent the free world and freedom and peace, to the point where the Apollo space program ended and we actually had a joining with the Soviet Union in space. And we had that famous moment where the two astronauts, if some of you know your history, the Soviets sent a cosmonaut up, and we sent an astronaut up, and they actually shook hands in space to represent peace up there. So we see, of course, a lot of companies, many of you may know the Blockbuster story. They actually had a chance to buy Netflix. They had a chance to partner with Netflix and turn them down. They didn't think streaming was going to be a thing. We know that Amazon, many of you may have heard Jeff Bezos talk about his day one philosophy, which is that we have to always operate as if it's day one. We have to be in a fervent mode and a paranoid mode of realizing that at any point it could become day two and we could be on our way out of business. And he even warned shareholders that that's always a risk. So with the Verde Group, they didn't stand still. They've come out with other offerings as time has gone on. So that's another example of what you can do to stay ahead of the competition. So these are the four pieces. This is the basic framework that you want to follow. I go through each one in detail in the book, and I've designed it intentionally that you can follow it step by step and implement it on your own. I didn't want to write a book that was just a big commercial for my services by any means. This is intended to be standalone. I even provide worksheets that let you get started right away, so you can boil it all down to one page, a one-page plan to start implementing immediately. So my hope for you is that you will come up with your own moonshot, whether you are CEO of a large company, whether you're a product manager at a smaller company, whether you're an independent entrepreneur, or just somebody with a startup idea. I hope you can set your own moonshot and achieve it, hopefully with help from the Apollo Method for Market Dominance. So if you want to go out and get the book, here's where you can get it. Just put into Amazon, Be the Go-To. You can put my name in. It might come up without that, but that can't hurt. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Paula. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can have a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Teresa. That was wonderful. I have read the book cover to cover. As you can see, I've got lots of Post-it notes and highlighting throughout it. One of the things that I did want to tell our attendees is that there are lots of worksheets in this book. So it's super practical. So you answer and you ask a lot of questions. So I found that really helpful. But I do have some questions, and a lot of questions came up when I reflected on some of our clients. So some of our clients, and I can see some of them are actually attendees on this webinar, they are large, complex, multi-divisional, global organizations. And I thought about the Apollo method and thinking about, okay, let's take, for example, a pharmaceutical company like J&J, where they've got consumer products, pharma, and medical devices. How does the Apollo method work for not just global organizations? Clearly works for small companies, absolutely, but can it work within a division of an organization? Can it work within a product line or a business unit? And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, you can apply this at any level of the organization and at all levels of the organization. So you can have your umbrella moonshot and what you stand for and what overarching problem you want to solve in the marketplace. So for example, Procter & Gamble has all of its individual brands, but at the umbrella level, they basically stand for innovation that solves problems in the home. And then each of their products addresses a separate problem. And each of their brands has its own, moonshot and its own approach to dominance within its own category. So you can definitely apply it at all levels. But you know what? If you lead a division or if you're a product manager and the rest of the company doesn't quite have its head around this, or they don't know about it or haven't embraced it, you can still apply it within your own specific business unit or organization.
Okay, excellent. That's awesome. Then there's the problem of being the go-to in an already saturated market where there are already go-tos. For example, when Uber came up with their ride-sharing service, they were the go-to. They were the only ones in town. And then came Lyft, and it's like, wow, how does Lyft, mark out its territory? How does it achieve dominance when the go-to is already Uber? So let's say I discovered a new ride-sharing service. So how does an organization really establish a go-to status in a market that has seemingly go-to players already? For example, could there be another Amazon as an example? Could there be, another, well, one would say that Walmart and Amazon do compete with each other, but I'm just thinking about markets like Airbnb. We know that VRBO was the predecessor to Airbnb, but they never really carved out their niche. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how an organization can carve out a go-to status in an already crowded, perceived go-to market?
Yes, the key is, well, there are two keys. One is focus on an untapped market, an unanswered or unsolved market problem, or an untapped opportunity. And part of that may involve subdividing. So a great example is in social networking, you had MySpace and a couple of other dominant social networking platforms that existed, and they were broad and all-purpose. And then Facebook came along, and Facebook narrowed down and subdivided and focused initially it just focused on Harvard students. And then it got traction there. And this is a big strategy in the book, is a strategy for how you get market traction and the way in which you approach your market using a dartboard metaphor for defining which market you're going to go after in what sequence. So Facebook focused first on Harvard students. Then they opened it up to anybody with an Ivy League, any student with an Ivy League email address. And then they opened it up to another, that was, Harvard was the center of their dartboard, then Ivy League, and then they opened it up to a handful of other schools like Stanford, and there were a couple of other prestigious universities in the US that they opened it up to. And then they opened it up to a slightly broader, and then they, once they had strong traction, they opened it up to anybody. And with that kind of traction and what they stood for, they had a much clearer purpose to connect everyone. And they gained the kind of market presence and dominance that actually, nobody even knows about MySpace anymore. These other platforms actually went away. But you look at LinkedIn, and they focus just on the professional side. So they don't try to compete with Facebook. They're after a separate market. So the key is what problem you're solving and what markets you're serving, and going after, if somebody already owns kind of the big picture, go in and specialize and solve a particular segment's problems better than the generalist ever could.
Okay, awesome. I'm starting to get questions coming in, but I do have one more. So clearly we're living in crazy times, and it would be insane for me not to mention COVID and how so many organizations are being really rethinking about how they need to transform and reinvent themselves because of COVID. So there's a lot of struggling. There's a lot of, stress, financial stress for companies. And I'm thinking about, is this the worst time? Is this the best time? Like, how do we tell companies that are struggling under the crazy COVID, as well as the recession that we're all experiencing? Is there an opportunity for them to apply some of these principles, knowing that they might not have the financial means to do so? So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, the key to everything, and the key really to the Apollo method from the get-go, is focusing on problems, or opportunities. But in an environment like this, where a lot of people have a lot of problems, if you focus on problems, people will often pay to solve those problems. So if too often companies have offerings that are solutions looking for a problem. And you want to make sure that you're starting with the market need. And if you really understand what the market needs and look for a common, critical, urgent problem. There are lots of issues these days. And I'm working with some clients right now who all of their revenue was dependent on large events or large gatherings, in-person activity. And so all of their revenue has gone away. So we're looking at how do they connect with their customers and offer value that is no longer dependent on those events, but where they can still offer some kind of value that customers are willing to pay for. So this can be a great time to start a new business or bring out new offerings, especially if you're bringing out new offerings. For a new initiative, you can only handle so much demand anyway, and you're trying to fumble your way through to figure out what customers want, test it, get feedback, refine it. So you're not ready to go big anyway. And so while the market is a little slow, this is actually a great time for new initiatives and for startups. During the Great Recession in 2008, I was working with the Stanford Technology Ventures program. It's a technology entrepreneurship education and research program in the School of Engineering there. And I was interviewed by different publications, and I was telling them, this is a great time to start a business. go do it. And you know, a lot of people who've been involved in entrepreneurship for years will tell you that these are excellent times for those types of activities.
And I guess you can be an entrepreneur within a large corporation as well.
Absolutely.
Entrepreneurial. Okay,
Yeah.
excellent.
Yeah.
One of my audience attendees has posed a question, which I think is an excellent one. Often we get a very similar question as well. So you've implemented this Apollo method for some of your clients. I'm guessing, yes, Teresa, probably many clients in several industries. Which phase, because we've talked about launch, ignite, navigate, accelerate, which of those phases would you say companies struggle with the most? Is it the launch phase? Is it defining that we're going to own this particular nook? Which is the phase, and I'm just guessing because I think I've seen a lot of my clients struggle with, you know, that vision statement. It's like, what do we want to be when we grow up, and what do we want to own and dominate? But from your experience, what do you see as the ones, the phases that companies struggle with the most?
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of them are lacking that clear idea of what they want to own. They're very vague in what they want to mean out in the market, and they're too often they're trying to be all things to all people, and they're afraid to narrow down and get more specific. And I try to emphasize in the book that being specific and narrow doesn't mean being small. You can go after a massive market that's very specific. All it needs to be is big enough for you. It doesn't need to be big enough, and it just needs to be big enough for you now. It doesn't need to be big enough for you 10 years from now, because you're going to evolve and expand, broaden your market, your target markets. But for getting a foothold, you need to be specific. And so that's a big issue, is they're not clear on what they want to own, and then they don't have a point of view. They might have points of, very often, especially content marketing is a bit of a peeve of mine, because too many companies just throw toilet paper at the wall to see what's going to stick. You know, an article about this, an article about that, a white paper, an ebook, a presentation, webinars, you name it. And they don't have a clear theme and point of view, and it should not have to do with you. It needs to be market oriented. So the point of view should be, here's the problem that you're going to face and why it's such a big problem, and here's what you need to do about it. I don't have to talk about myself at all. I'm just focused on helping you understand where the market's going and what your problem and challenge is going to be, and what the fallout is going to be if you don't fix it. And here's what companies need to do. And then you can follow with your solution. But too many companies lack that point of view. So they don't have a bigger meaning out in the market. So that's one. And then the same with the Ignite phase. They don't go out and lead a movement around their point of view. They try to generate attention and lead a movement around themselves. And we don't really care about you. We care, the audience is saying, what about me? All I care, what's in it for me? What are you going to do for me? And, I don't know how many of your audience are familiar with Salesforce, but it's a big CRM, customer relationship management software company. But when Mark Benioff started Salesforce, he didn't even talk about his product. He talked about software needs to die. His whole point of view was enterprise software needs to go. It's too expensive. It's too cumbersome to implement. You need legions of consultants. By the time you get done customizing it and implementing it, things have changed and you have to start all over again. He said, that's ridiculous. There's no reason to do that. We need to get rid of enterprise software, put it in the cloud, and let somebody else deal with all that background stuff so that you can focus on your business. That was his whole, he was a total Pied Piper when it came to this message. He would get up at conferences, I would see him present. He did not even talk about Salesforce. He talked about this message. So that's a big mistake a lot of companies make.
It's funny in the book. I think you often define the CRM as what is it? Something about millions of dollars costing
Oh,
that the
consultants raking in millions.
right. That's excellent. I love that because I'm like, oh my God, that's so true. Um, you know, I know this is a difficult question, but a lot of companies would ask us, they ask us when we start a program, how long is this going to take and how much is this going to cost? So the cost side is a difficult one, but time, like how do we know an organization should be spending enough time in the launch phase and the ignite phase? So what would be your recommended sort of life cycle for those first two phases, which I think are critically important? Because obviously accelerate and navigate, or navigate and accelerate are the continuous improvement, and those are lifelong journeys of always reinventing yourself and improving yourself. But those first two, launch and ignite, what would you say would be a typical, you spend enough time in these phases?
Yeah, well, certainly for planning them, you can do it fairly quickly. First of all, you need all four phases, but you don't have to do them sequentially. And I really encourage companies to basically start with where you are now. Many companies might have a product, they might have some level of message, and it may not be perfect, but work with what you've got. And that's one of the reasons in the book I help people boil it down to just a one-page plan, because I really want to urge people just to get started. So, you come up with an action plan that's just based on what you have available now so that you can make some kind of improvement on the way things are happening currently in your operation. And then you can add pieces and improve and build on things. So there's a client I'm working with right now. They're really struggling with how to capture their purpose or their overall high level umbrella. Here's what we stand for. So we're not letting them get hung up on that. We're moving ahead on implementing other pieces while they figure some of that out. And they can make a lot of progress on implementing other components of the methodology. So that's the big thing. So you can actually start seeing impact quite quickly. I mean, within even weeks or months. And it doesn't have to cost you any more than what you're spending now, because very often what you do is you redirect wasted resources from unhelpful activities to more focused, purposeful, strategic activities that work together. So one of the benefits of the Apollo method is it really integrates all the different things that you're doing and has them helping each other. Whereas in a lot of companies, a lot of those efforts are quite siloed and they aren't as powerful as they could be.
Excellent. I'm getting more questions coming from our panelists. So let's see. This is an interesting one. So let's say you've got an organization that, let's say you're the go-to. You think you're the go-to, and you're trying to get a company to think that you are the go-to, as an example. There's so many biases inside organizations and not a lot of alignment on who the go-to is in a particular space. And that alignment building phase of defining, I can imagine sitting in a room with a bunch of executives saying, we're going to be the go-to. Well, let's think of examples like who is the go-to in this area, in this space, and how do you knock down those internal biases that might exist and have disagreement on what a go-to looks like?
Well, it's so funny. One of my big catalysts for doing this research and coming up with a methodology is my frustration at dealing with clients. Even as I was facing my own pricing pressures, I would be talking to clients and saying, you sound like everybody else. You look the same. You are a total me too. Our slogan is be the go-to, not a me too. And they'd say, no, 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 we have the best people. We have the best product. We have the best methodology, yada, yada, yada. I'd say they all say that. And so actually in the book, I have a quiz. It's the Me Too test. So I actually have a series of questions to help you figure out, are you a go-to or are you a Me Too? And I also have the lineup test, which is to take general descriptions of other companies in your space, strip off the names, put them next to each other and hand them to other people and say, can you tell which one is us? Can you tell us apart from anybody else? And often those boilerplate paragraphs all sound identical. Agencies are notorious for this. Most professional services are notorious for this. Many product companies, SaaS companies, they all look and sound the same. So it's now, especially with digital marketing, it's much easier to see what the competition is saying and how you don't sound different.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just have to put it in front of people.
One of the other questions that I actually got is one of the things that, and this is obviously someone from the audience who has read the book or read portions of it. You talk about in the book that one of the first important steps in the launch phase is to do a market studies, to truly understand pain points that are existing maybe in your customers. So the customers that you're targeting. How relevant is it, and how important is it to also understand the pain points that your competitors are experiencing? To what extent does that factor into your understanding of the market?
You mean the pain points that they're addressing with in their market?
Yeah.
So understanding the competition?
That customers are experiencing with competitors. So if you wanted to figure out, we're going to own this particular market, well, what is the pain that current providers are creating, in the marketplace?
Yeah, so a big, the big thing is understanding, it's looking at problems that are happening now and also what's on the horizon. So one of the reasons you pick an area to own is that you're going to always be watching what's coming down the pike on behalf of your market. You're paying attention to where the technology is going. You're paying attention to best practices. You're paying attention to big trends that are going to impact and change their world or rock their world, sometimes for the worse. And the competition plays into that to a point. But one thing I caution people against is getting too fixated on what the competition is doing, because that's where you end up in that incremental approach to trying to stay ahead of the competition, and you can't control them. So the bigger thing is being way out in front and looking at what's coming. And then certainly talking to customers, but also, of course, non-customers. You could talk to your competitors' customers to find out, what pain points is nobody addressing, because that's really what you're trying to figure out. What are the unmet needs, and where can you really make a difference? I wouldn't get too fixated on the hot, shiny object of the day versus looking out at the enduring trends that are going to be impacting people long term.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. And this question is about the overall approach. And the question is, what would you say are a couple of these, super important and often overlooked concepts inside any of those phases? Like, what are the things that you want attendees in this webinar to take away that aren't necessarily so obvious from perhaps the presentation that you just gave?
Yeah, I know, because at the 50,000 foot level, this all sounds like common sense. And in fact, I have tried to not write this book for years because I kept thinking, surely somebody else is going to come out and talk about how all these different pieces fit together. And nobody did. And so I finally realized, okay, I'm going to have to do this because it's a lot of work to write a book. But a few key things really pop out. One is that, owning that market problem and having that point of view. So that I've talked about that. That's a big one. Another one is people don't really understand the dynamics within the Ignite phase of how you can leverage power brokers in the industry, in your industry, to accelerate your becoming part of the fabric of the industry. So you don't want to try to go it alone. And I see a lot of companies trying to do that. But you can leverage that power broker dynamic that's out there. And there's not time in this forum to get into it, but it's laid out in the book. And I definitely recommend, I mean, the book is worth reading just for a few of these key passages about some of these core concepts. Then another one is the whole innovation adoption curve and the sequence in which different profiles of buyers or customers will adopt a new technology. This is based on research that goes back to like the 1920s and 30s on farmers adopting new agricultural technology. And they were looking at what is the sequence in which different types of people adopt that technology and what causes them to adopt it. It's a bell curve. I go into that in detail in the book, and that's a mistake I see a lot of companies. They try to treat all customers in their segments as if they have the same rate of adoption, and they need to segment those into different groups and approach them in the right sequence. So that's a big one. And then it's the solution approach, really delivering a result instead of just products and services with features and functions.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so we have approximately 10 minutes left, and I know that gives us time actually for one more question, and I've got like 5 in waiting. So I'm just going to ask you this one last question. So one panelist is asking, is there a difference? Does the Apollo method apply differently for B2B companies versus B2C companies?
Years ago, I would have said it only applies to B2B. And then digital marketing came along, and what has been fascinating is that the strategies and go-to-market approaches for B2C and B2B have become closer and closer. So B2B marketing practices and strategy practices have moved toward what we used to only see in B2C and vice versa. So now, yes, there might be some nuances in how you apply it, but you'll see in the book that I seamlessly go back and forth between B2C and B2B examples. And so it was interesting to me to watch the world evolve and see that this started to apply to a broader range of companies. When I first developed it, I really was mostly focused on IT services. That was my background, and that's where I saw a huge problem. But the problem basically then spread to everybody else. So yes, pretty similar.
It's funny that you say that. I guess it depends on our experience, because when I read the book, I actually thought the opposite. I thought, well, I can see this being a B2C play. And I think of industries that are highly commoditized, and they really are in the consumer space. When I think of consumer packaged goods, well, hello, totally commoditized. Even retail, mass merchandisers, hugely commoditized. Department stores, like how do you differentiate a Macy's from, I don't know, Lord and Taylor? Like you started to, even though they perform differently, but companies that sell the same merchandise and to the customer, they're kind of blah. So I do a lot of work in retail, and I just find it's a big challenge, especially with Amazon, which is the frenemy of all retail. Anyways, well, what I wanted to do is thank everyone again for participating in this webinar. I want to firstly thank Teresa for your time. So thank you so much, Teresa. It was awesome. And again, if you haven't had a chance to get the book, it is downloadable in your Kindle through Amazon. I actually have both versions, so the hard copy allowed me to take notes. It's very useful. And of course, if you want to continue this conversation on how to own your market and be a leader, both Teresa and I are available to continue our conversation separately. So on that note, I want to thank everyone for your participation. I hope you have a wonderful day. And Teresa, if you want to say any parting words to our audience.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for your attention and time today. And I do hope you will apply at least some of this, because it can make an immediate difference in your business. And it can also be a great way to bring the whole organization, whether that's the division or the department or the whole company, together and help everybody understand how all the pieces fit together and how you can basically row in concert with each other to get across the river.
Wonderful. Excellent. And so those of you who are asking if there is a recording of this webinar, the answer is yes. And for those of you who participated, we can share the recording separately. So I will definitely look into that, and we did record this webinar. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. I'm now going to end our webinar.